good evening, and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote in Concord, New Hampshire. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator at Gibson's, and I am very pleased to welcome author John Nichols joining us tonight. He is the author of Coronavirus, Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers, Accountability for Those Who Caused the Crisis. John, welcome.
Hey, it's a great honor to be with you, and a great honor to be back in Concord, at least virtually. I've spent a lot of my life in Concord as somebody who covers presidential politics, and I've skulked around the bookshelves of Gibson's many a day in January and February of leap years.
Well, welcome back. You are joined in conversation by Concord's own Arnie Arneson. Arnie, hello.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I've known John since 1991, so we go around a couple of decades, and I probably dozens of books since I first met him. So it's a pleasure.
We're going to have a lot to talk about. Coronavirus, Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers is available from Gibson's Bookstore. Without further ado, John, Arnie, take it away.
So for those of you who are not familiar with John Nichols, and I can't imagine there's anyone out there that's not, let me just remind you that he writes about politics for The Nation magazine. He's their national affairs correspondent. He also has writes for In These Times. He is a contributing writer to The Progressive. He lives in Wisconsin. And I was looking at the books that you've written, and just the titles alone make you one of the most interesting people I think I know. Here's one of them. It's the media, stupid. Or how about this? Dick, the man who is president, the rise of Richard B. Cheney, unlocking the mysteries of the most powerful vice president in American history. Or Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, a field guide to the most dangerous people in America. And frankly, this one, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party. And of course, now we're at your new book. And your new book is Angry. I read it and I got angry. I was angry to start because I knew I was going to be angry, because I knew it was about, coronavirus, criminals, and right away you're already sort of seething. But what is so amazing to me is that you've done such a remarkable job, because if you look at the table of contents, everyone, each chapter is for the most part a different person. He's got a couple of governors. He's obviously got Trump. He's got the chief of staff. He's got people like Betsy DeVos. He obviously focuses on the profiteers, Pfizer, Bezos. But each chapter you can read and put the book down. It's not like you have to sort of continue, but you have to continue, because after reading the chapter, you're going, I forgot this. I thought I remembered this. I didn't know this. Because what you've done is you've taken Mike Pence or Donald Trump or Jared Kushner, and while we know about their influence and what they've done during the course of the last couple of years as a result of this pandemic, you provide us with both a history and a detail that I think a lot of us missed, because there was such a cacophony of news being thrown at us all the time that there was no way you could hold on to what exactly was Mike Pence responsible for? What didn't he do? I mean, how do you hold on to this? You can't. And maybe that was their gift, that they were able to hide behind that cacophony. But what you've done in this book is that you've exposed them, and you've taken us down that sort of rat hole that they were living in. And I think that that's so important. But I'm going to start by saying, a lot of people are going to be writing about Trump and about the pandemic. What drove you to write about it? Why did you need to write this book now? Because clearly, I get the sense you were driven to write it.
There's no question of that, Arnie, and thanks so much for being here tonight, and thanks to Gibson's as well. I, as you know, have known you for many decades, and so you'll understand the motivation very well. And that is that I was doing my job. I cover politics for a living, and I cover the news of the moment. And when the pandemic hit, I remember the last event I did. It was a speech to teachers in Columbus, Ohio, and then going out to dinner with a friend in late February of 2020, and then getting on the plane, coming home. I was supposed to go to the Arizona Book Festival or Tucson Book Festival in a week or so, and suddenly everything was canceled. And of course, when you're in such a jarring moment, especially when it comes in the midst of a presidential race, you start to look at how it's affecting people, how it's affecting the moment. And some of the first interviews I did were with transit workers, with bus drivers and subway workers and their unions. And it became very, very clear immediately that people on the ground knew what we needed to do, and yet it wasn't happening. And so I decided to do what I think a lot of journalists do, which is keep two files. The one file for the story you're working on. And I wrote a lot of stories early on about the deaths of transit workers, the deaths of nurses, the deaths and the trauma that frontline and essential workers were going through. But another file on the failures of the political class, those who were in power, to respond in the moment and with any kind of vision, and also about the economic powers, the economic elites, if you will, corporate folks as well as billionaires, who were clearly coming out ahead in this situation. And I wrote early on about the insight that we've all gotten from Naomi Klein about the shock doctrine and disaster capitalism. This notion that when something bad happens, instead of all throwing in to try and solve the problem, too many of our political and economic elites look at how they can get ahead politically and how they can get ahead economically. And it became very, very clear to me quickly that we were experiencing the shock doctrine on steroids, that we were going to end up seeing a huge economic divide that would open up, that the inequality would get worse, that we were going to clearly see a situation where political players would divide us rather than unite us. That was evident even in late March, early April of 2020. And so I determined pretty early on that I was going to write about this. And I also determined pretty early on that it wouldn't just be portrayal of people who did the wrong thing, although I do a lot of that in the book. It would also be an examination of the question of accountability. And it goes to a core question. In fact, I write it in one of the chapters in the book. Why does it always turn out this way?
Yeah, exactly. So just before I came on, I wanted to see how many people have died as a result of COVID-19. We're up to 888,000, okay? And that was these are 24 hours old, so the number will clearly increase. And as I was looking at this number, I mentioned to you this before, that sometimes the more who die, sometimes the less we care. And this philosopher wrote, statistics are human beings with tears dried off. Listen to that term, with tears dried off. And that's dangerous because we need tears to motivate us. And I guess as I'm reading your book, I needed the book now because I needed to be motivated, because in some ways I feel dulled by the statistics. And I think that the profiteers know that. And I think the power players and the criminals know that. That, you know, in a lot of ways, one of the reasons why Donald Trump didn't want to acknowledge or embrace the pandemic was that he was looking at the politics that would benefit him, you know. And I think that that's part of the problem is that it's almost predictable what they do with us, because they put profits over people. They put politics over people, and we are expendable. And I think one of the reasons why reading this book is so powerful is that each chapter makes you angry, because you need to get that anger back in order to be motivated to demand the kind of accountability you say is essential, John.
Yeah, and you're right, Arnie. One of the things that I did with the book is to try and start most of the chapters with the story of an individual who died. And the first person in the book is not Donald Trump, but a fellow named Mike Jackson, who was in his 40s, a father, African-American father in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had a large family, worked at a manufacturing plant, very afraid, as his mother said, of losing his job, especially as all the layoffs started when the pandemic hit, but also very aware that his job was unsafe. And like so many of the people I write about in the book, he tried to communicate immediately that his workplace was unsafe. He and his union signaled that they didn't have proper barriers between workers, so they were like literally looking at one another as they worked on their machinery. They didn't have proper masking and other protections. And even though he tried to communicate this, there wasn't a level of protection. His government didn't come in and regulate quickly and effectively as they could have, and as governments in other countries did. Remember, this is a global pandemic. His employer did not provide the level of protection that was needed. And Mike Jackson got sick. He fell sick early on, left work one day, was coughing and not feeling well, but, roused himself to go back in because he was afraid of losing his job. And ultimately collapsed at his machine, was taken out of work, ended up in the hospital, and did die. And I tell his story as I do stories of bus drivers who passed, and nurses and factory workers, people in meatpacking plants, immigrants who died, because I think it's important to say their names, to realize that this was a human crisis. These were human beings that we lost, not just in this country, but around the world. But we lost people at a disproportional level in this country. When the Lancet magazine, the British Journal of Medicine, studied the disproportional deaths in the United States, they determined after the first year of the pandemic that roughly 40% of the deaths in the United States were unnecessary. They did not need to happen. And so what that means is that we had hundreds of thousands of people die unnecessarily, of that larger figure you gave, millions of people who got sick unnecessarily, tens of millions who suffered economic dislocation, mental health challenges, all the crises that have extended from this pandemic. And really what we have to ask ourselves is, if we have this disproportional impact here, so many cases where we are worse than what happened in other countries, who is responsible for that? Why is the United States the wealthiest country in the world? It's an incredibly powerful country. Why did it do such a lousy job? And once we recognize that that's the case, then we start to peel back and identify the bad players, the individuals who could have saved Mike Jackson's life and could have saved the lives of other people I write about in the book. Because I think that's the way that we, as you suggest, muster the anger that is necessary to demand accountability. And accountability in turn is necessary because history tells us that it is only accountability that drives change. That unless we hold people to account, we will not get the changes that we need systemically and frankly as regards the individuals who did wrong.
So let me just share with the audience a little bit of the titles, because I want to focus on one of them. The Killing Presidency of Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Yes Man of the Apocalypse, The Grounding of Jared Kushner. Now, the one chapter I want you to talk about, especially since you began with Mike Jackson, is The Unmasking of Mark Meadows. Because when I think of this pandemic, I don't think of vaccines. I think of masks, and I think of the mask wars, and I think of my New Hampshire legislature, where you see a whole group of old white men not wearing masks, and the fact that the Speaker of the House, before he even gavelled in the first meeting, died of COVID. All right, so the story of Meadows, I think, is a really important one, because it really does talk about the raw politics and how we were so expendable, because it turns out more people were on the mask page. But Mark Meadows and Stephen Miller came in and things changed. Let people know this story. It is remarkable.
Well, this is one of the realities of the crisis and of the pandemic itself. We think of economic downturns and pandemics and a lot of the things that traumatize our society as natural disasters. They're like a hurricane or like a tornado. And there's an element of that. I mean, this pandemic was global. It affected countries around the world, but yet our response was so much worse than so many other places. And so then you have to start to look at the decisions that were made along the way. And that's why I say the people responsible for the crisis, because there was a crisis at a baseline, but what made it so overwhelming was bad decisions along the way. And when you bring up Mark Meadows, I mean, that's the classic example. Early on, there were Republicans, conservative Republicans, who said to Donald Trump, look, masks are a good idea. It's very, very clear we can save millions of lives. We can slow the spread of this disease. And ultimately, if we all mask up, we're going to be able to do an intervention, an interruption in the spread of the disease that could potentially, ideally with some lockdown as well, could potentially allow us to reopen more quickly, to get kids back to schools more quickly. And so it was a logical argument. And the incredible thing was that a group of Trump aides and allies decided to have an intervention with him. And they had a meeting where they made the argument for a national masking order and for a number of interventions that would help to slow the spread of the disease at a very critical early stage. And they seem to be getting pretty good traction with it. Trump was clearly interested in this. They were making the case, and this was necessary with Trump, that it was to his political advantage to get in front of this thing. They even brought in a pollster who said, you know, look, the evidence is that Republicans will accept a mask mandate if you say it's a good idea. And so everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. And then Mark Meadows, who was the chief of staff, and Stephen Miller came in and said, no, we can't do this because our ideology, our position is that mandates are bad. And that if we do that, we'll undermine some of our ideological arguments. We may suffer with the base a little bit, et cetera. And so they actually convinced Trump to back off from doing what his wiser allies and wiser aides were telling him to do. And we didn't get the national mask mandate, nor did we get it, you know, through other agencies of the cabinet, which could have intervened in particular sectors and in particular areas of the economy. And so I wrote about, you know, Meadows in that regard, but it's important to understand he is not the only example of someone who, you know, looked at a crisis and said, what's my political play? Exactly. What's my ideological play in this crisis? It happened again and again and again at the local, state, and national levels. And there is simply no question that because of that, people died unnecessarily.
And the reason I wanted to talk about the masks is that I wanted people to hear about Mark Meadows and this brutal political decision. But then I wanted you to explain why you put Elaine Chao into your book, because again, masks become part of the conversation because of the power that she had to be able to protect those frontline transportation workers and airline workers, but she refused to do anything. I think people they don't even realize that there was so much opportunity here to save lives, and there was no rational reason to not do it. But like Meadows, you have Elaine Chao, who, as you say in your book, I mean, she's been around the block. She's been around every administration you could possibly imagine. So she knows how the game is played. But what did Elaine Chao not do that she could have done?
Now, again, this is in this chapter. I start with a bus driver up in Washington State, north of Seattle, a fellow who in February of 2020, even before most Americans were thinking about the pandemic, he was a very well-read guy. He was reading what was going on overseas in China and other places. And he was writing on his union website saying, you know, our buses are like cruise ships on land. Because, of course, some of the initial cases of the pandemic where it spread very quickly was on cruise ships. And he says, we're kind of the same thing. A lot of people get on from all sorts of different places. They bring whatever diseases they have. And we're in this enclosed setting. It's in winter time. And we're not protected. And ultimately, this guy was warning and making very logical arguments that we needed to have face coverings and things like this back in February of 2020. And he ended up dying. A young father, his children left behind, a terribly traumatic story of how one of his fellow workers was driving his wife and kids to the hospital to see him, and they got a call from the hospital that said, "You're not going to get here in time. You're not going to make it." And so they were saying their goodbyes over the telephone, as it happens so often in cases like this. So I start with that story, and then I trace it back and say, well, who could have intervened? I mean, who could have jumped in here to address this challenge? And the fact is, we learned that Elaine Chao, the Secretary of Transportation, one of the most powerful people in America, the wife of Mitch McConnell, former cabinet secretary, who frankly had a lot of leeway in this administration. I mean, she was appointed by Trump, but she clearly had standing as a former cabinet secretary with ties to a lot of the conservative and economic elites and elites within the Republican Party, could have easily issued a national mask mandate for public transportation. It would not have been an unreasonable intervention. And the interesting thing was, from very early on, there were people begging her to do it, literally saying, this has to happen. The union sent letters, public health experts sent letters. They didn't do it once. They did it again and again and again. They finally filed formal complaints and made formal demands. And at every turn, she rejected them. She said no. And the incredible thing about it is that we did get a mask mandate for public transportation. It came the day that Trump left office, right? And it could have come before. There's simply no question. And here in this chapter, I tell about, not just this fellow up in Washington State, but the subway workers and the transit workers in New York City. And it was just so tragic because there were so many dying that one transit worker in New York created a Facebook site just to keep track of who all had died. And there were people who literally saw themselves as sitting ducks, right? That they were very likely to get sick. And yet these folks felt a sense of duty, perhaps to their family because this was a job and they needed the paycheck, but many of them a sense of duty to society. They knew that they had to get nurses and doctors to work, that they had to get sick people to the hospital. And so they showed up and they sacrificed immensely. And all that they asked was that their government might have their back, that their employers might have their back. It was not a big demand. It is a baseline demand of humanity, and yet it was not met. And hundreds of transit workers died across the country, communities all over the country. Flight attendants died at disproportional numbers early on. I mean, these are horror stories, and they didn't need to happen.
You also want to make sure that people look beyond Donald Trump and look beyond this administration. You want to know that a lot of these seeds were already planted, a decade before or 20 years before. And one of the people that you use to share that story is Rahm Emanuel.
Yeah.
And I remember we talked about this before, that at the beginning of the pandemic, we knew we had nothing. We had none of the protective equipment that we needed. We didn't have the N95s. We didn't have the masks. We didn't have the cloth that would go over hospital workers. And one of the statistics in your story under Rahm Emanuel is that 95% of surgical masks and 70% of respirators used in the United States are produced where? Abroad. The last domestic penicillin plant closed in 2004. So the story of this pandemic is not only the story of people that were doing political calculations, but we keep hearing now the story of supply chain. But the supply chain story went immediately to the very beginning of the pandemic. And you turn to the story of Rahm Emanuel. Why did you use Rahm as your poster child for the failure of the supplies that we saw in the pandemic? Because it's not just, obviously, the healthcare industry that's facing a supply chain problem. It's almost pervasive in the car industry and whatever. But Rahm Emanuel, I think, is a perfect person to sort of tell that narrative. And how did we get here?
Well, I wanted to make sure that people understood that it wasn't just Republicans that screwed this up. And in fact, there were some Republicans who did a very good job, who tried hard. And so when we look at this, we needed to understand the deeper roots of it, that it was something beyond just partisan politics, that this was systemic. And in this case, through the 1990s and 2000s, we had a sort of consensus among the political elites in both political parties that free trade was a good idea, that it was okay to have what some referred to as creative destruction, i.e. we would lose thousands of factories, we would lose whole industries in the United States, but somehow it would turn out okay. And so our elites became incredibly romantic. And there was nobody more romantic than Rahm Emanuel, who lived in kind of a fantasy world where he said, yeah, somehow it's all going to work out. Well, what they did was they created a road out of the United States for industries for factories and stuff like that. And it wasn't free trade. It was a avenue by which multinational corporations could race to the bottom. They could find the lowest wages, the least regulations, and make the most money. And Rahm Emanuel was fine with that. He became, the voice of corporate power in the Clinton administration, then in the Obama administration as a key aide, and always arguing that this was going to work out fine. But when the pandemic hit, it didn't work out fine. In fact, it was a disastrous circumstance. We literally had nurses, using garbage bags to protect themselves in hospitals in New York, pictures of them doing this. And what we learned was that we had shut down the industries. We had shut down the basic factories and production that we needed. Now, I'm not somebody who's against all trade, quite the opposite. I'm an internationalist. I believe in trade, and I know that some places may do things better than other places, but that's not what this was. This was a case of making it cheaper and actually, in fact, encouraging companies to move production overseas via the trade policies. And it was also a lack of planning, a lack of an industrial policy that would have given us, some protection where we say, well, some industries we just can't let shut down. We can't lose them. And one of the people I interviewed when working on this chapter was Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, who is a longtime critic of these free trade policies, also another internationalist. And the interesting thing about Sherrod Brown was when I interviewed him in March of 2020, he said, look, we're going to have a huge problem because we simply don't have the industries, here anymore. And he was actually personally going and talking to factory owners and saying, can you restart production in this area? And he couldn't get the Trump administration excited about that, engaged. Instead, and I talk about this in another chapter, President Trump appointed his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to take over the supply chain. And what Kushner did was come up with a plan to give multinational corporations more money and more flexibility so that they could import items from other countries, but they didn't regulate them sufficiently. So these companies brought in the protective gear and then sold it off to the highest bidder. We ended up in a situation where we still didn't get the protective gear and the medical equipment to the people who needed it most. And so we were let down by history, by a pattern of free trade and neoliberalism. And then when the crisis hit, we were let down by a combination of incompetence, and Jared Kushner is incompetent, and still this ideological obsession with a theory that the market is going to solve every problem. The market didn't solve every problem, and millions of people got sick. Hundreds of thousands of people died who didn't need to die, many of them who could have been protected if we had just had a basic industrial policy that said some industries won't be allowed to disappear.
The second half of your title is "And Pandemic Profiteers." And you go to Pfizer, and of course you go to Bezos. And I think we need to talk about Pfizer because Pfizer made more money than one could possibly imagine. And of course, everybody was so grateful because they came up with these vaccines.
Of course.
So let's share the dirty little secret. Was it really Pfizer and Moderna that came up with the vaccines? Or was it the fact that the government had been working on this issue for over, who knows, 10, 20 years? And to a large extent, they had actually gotten out of the vaccine business because it wasn't lucrative, John. It wasn't lucrative. So suddenly we have a worldwide pandemic and, ooh, guess what's lucrative? So we think that we somehow need to genuflect to these, these pharmaceutical companies, when in fact, not only did they make money hand over fist and were guaranteed a huge source of income, but on top of that, they're not really the originators of this amazing technology that came up with this mRNA vaccine. And yet nobody actually connects those dots.
That's right. And I try to connect them in the book. And look, here's the reality. Pharmaceutical companies don't like vaccines. They like drugs that you have to take every day for the rest of your life, because that's a steady stream of revenue. Pharmaceutical companies are sort of capitalism on steroids. And so they were certainly open to doing the vaccines. And I think even there was some noble element there that they were like, yeah, of course we don't want people to get sick and die. love to be a part of this. But they clearly demanded huge incentives from the federal government. Some of the companies got, huge amounts of resources. And even beyond that, the baseline research was done by a sharing of DNA, by a sharing of information on a global scale, right? There was a huge commitment to make this happen, and a race by scientists, many of them who worked for the government, to get on top of this thing. And then when the vaccines were developed, these companies, especially Pfizer, demanded sweetheart deals, right? They would say, oh yeah, we can get you these vaccines, but we want a contract for the renewal of it, right? To get you more vaccines than when we create the next batch of it. And so they were clearly competing for position. Now, the end result of this is that the pharmaceutical companies made unimaginable amounts of money. I write in the book about how they would predict their earnings, and then the earnings turned out to be so much more than they had predicted that even their jaws dropped. The money kind of rolled in because of these sweetheart deals, this ongoing commitment by governments to just pay whatever they had to, especially in the developed, wealthier countries, literally, laying out huge amounts of money. Now, what happened is that we ended up with a situation where one research group determined that Pfizer and Moderna and their partners were making $1,000 a second, $65,000 a minute, $93 million a day, every second, every minute, every day, all of this money rolling in. And yet, when we asked them to share the vaccines, right, to share the strategies and said, look, you've made a lot of money. Can't we now just, get rid of these intellectual property barriers and make sure that everybody in the world can have access to this at the most affordable rate? Let governments, let other companies get into this. They said no. They have fought it and rejected it, and they haven't had the baseline decency. We talk about corporate citizenship, which I always think is something of an absurd term, but they haven't had the baseline decency to acknowledge that they've been made dramatically richer by this circumstance, and yet they will give nothing back. Throughout the pandemic, we talked about shared sacrifice. The nurses who went into hospitals with inadequate protection, they sacrificed. The bus drivers and transit drivers, they sacrificed. The meatpacking plant workers who died at exponential rates, they sacrificed. Teachers who died because they didn't have adequate protection, they sacrificed. Many did so because they thought they had a duty to society. And yet the pharmaceutical companies continue to refuse to sacrifice at even a baseline level. And I say this as somebody who's double vaccinated and boosted. I'm thrilled that the vaccines exist, but I am horrified by the profiteering. And there is simply no question. This is obscene profiteering.
So you're furious. The book is angry, but it's more than that. You actually are expressing a sense of urgency. And the urgency I get from reading your book is that you are looking at this sort of moat of impunity that surrounds the profiteers and the politicians, that no matter what they do wrong, they're never held accountable. And unless we hold them accountable, not only are we doomed to repeat this, but we won't be capable of doing the policy changes that we're going to need to do based on holding these individuals accountable. Courage to demand them. It's too easy to cave. It's too easy to say, oh, let's just keep going forward. Let's move on to tomorrow and not look back. But we have to look back. We have to demand accountability, because if we don't demand accountability, then guess what? They got away with it. Mm-hmm. And once everyone realizes they got away with it, they will do it as well in the future.
That's exactly right. And, not a deviation for the conversation, but just an observation that we're in the midst of a debate about whether to teach our history, right? The whole critical race theory debate, and whether we teach an accurate history of the United States. Why does that matter? It's not for history teachers, right? This is about society. If we don't teach an honest history of the past, where we do hold people to account when they held slaves, when they not just enslaved people, but enslaved society, when they supported Jim Crow segregation, all the genocide against Native Americans. I mean, we put all of this into the mix. That ideally forces us to acknowledge that we have to do more. We have to do better, right? And that's what I mean by accountability is first and foremost a recognition of wrongdoing, of failures. And one of the things that's striking to me in this pandemic is that it was clear very early on that there were people profiting at immense levels. It was clear very early on that politicians were failing us. And yet there has been virtually no accountability up to this point. And so you asked what I mean by accountability. I thought a lot about this and researched it a lot as I was working on these issues. And I think accountability can take many forms. It can certainly involve criminal, civil, and congressional action. That is entirely appropriate and indeed necessary. Where you identify wrongdoing, it's certainly appropriate to be able to charge a crime, to sue in court, to regulate, take congressional action. But it can also take a lot of other forms. And one form is taxation. And taxation is a huge form of accountability, because we can say to the billionaires who increase their wealth at an exponential rate. Remember that coming into this pandemic, billionaires, we had 614 billionaires in the United States. At this point, we now have at least 745, so a huge growth in the number of billionaires. Their wealth that they control extended from $3 trillion at the start of the pandemic to over $5 trillion today. That's a huge growth in wealth in a 2-year period. So we moved massive amounts of money into their accounts. And what did they do? Well, some of them did useful things, I'm sure of that. But was it useful at a level of exponential growth in their wealth? Did they engage in shared sacrifice? The answer is no. And so I reflect back on what Franklin Roosevelt determined during World War II, that it was appropriate to have a tax on excess profits, like the profits of the pharmaceutical companies. It was also appropriate to have a 95% top marginal tax rate, so that the wealthiest people, if you're taking in $1 billion or $10 billion or unimaginable billions like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, give us 95% of that. We'll let you keep enough to have the best mansion around. You can, if you scrimp a little bit, you can probably still even go fly off into outer space. But you don't get to take this huge amount of resources out of our collective good and put it into your bank account. And the final thing I'll say about accountability is that the most important accountability is the court of public opinion. We need to name and shame people so that, not just for the purpose of punishment, but so that they don't come back and do it to us again. It is jaw-dropping to me that Donald Trump handled the pandemic in the way that he did, and yet is, now when we talk about the possibility that he might run for president again in 2024, we do talk about what happened on January 6th, and that's really important. And we talk about, a lot of the aspects of his behavior, and all that's really important. But I mean, there's startlingly little talk about his horrific and deliberate mismanagement of the pandemic, and the fact that he intentionally lied to the American people about the severity of a public health crisis as it was coming on, and then bragged about it in interviews with Bob Woodward. I mean, this ought to be front and center stuff. And so when I talk about accountability, basically the reason I wrote the book is to make sure that we don't forget the names of the people and of the companies that failed us at a critical stage in our history, and frankly, that continue to fail us.
So John, I want to believe that we have the capacity to demand accountability. But I look at 9/11, I look at the economic downturn of 2008. I look at some of the things, I mean, you had to go back to the Great Depression to find accountability in FDR. It's a very different planet today than it was then. It's a very different media landscape than it was then. We're now in these little silos that there was then. There wasn't the Facebook and the Twitter and all the other things. And I am looking at the anger, and I want everyone to read every chapter and then share it with everyone they know, because you really do need to have the tears, and you do need to have the anger, and you do need to demand the accountability. I'm just terrified that we've been drained of of that ability, that we've been drained of being able to direct our anger and our tears in the right direction so that we can not only get the accountability, but then also get the policy changes we need. Is that possible today? That's what so terrifies me, is I'm not sure it is.
Well, you may be right. I don't know. We're in an experiment now. And as we were coming into this conversation, we were talking a little bit about my friend Rebecca Solnit, who wrote the book Hope in the Dark, which is her rumination on what it means to be hopeful in very, very difficult times. And she always distinguishes between hope and optimism. Because optimism is just saying, oh yeah, it's going to turn out fine. Hope is a desire that it would turn out fine, right? It is a determination that you will do what you can to try and make it turn out fine and believe that it is possible. But it isn't an assumption that it will. And I think that's where we have to come at this. We have to recognize there's no guarantee that there will be accountability, but there is the possibility that we can demand it. And one of our duties is to spell out what it would look like, how it can happen. That's what I try to do in the book in some detail, and where we might target our anger, not to just free-floating anger that can be exploited by politicians and by media elites, but a targeted anger that allows us to focus on the real wrongdoers and to focus on the policies that extend from it. And I'll be very blunt with you. I don't think the Biden administration has done enough. I've been very, very disappointed in their sort of determination to kind of move forward rather than to look back at the wrongdoing. And I think that's a mistake, and I'll tell you why. Franklin Roosevelt realized when he came into power that he would end up owning the Great Depression if he didn't point a finger of blame at the people who had exploited the circumstances of that Great Depression and identify the wrongdoers. And so Roosevelt was very passionate about accountability, and so were his allies in the Senate. They hired a lawyer who had been a New York prosecutor of mobsters, and they targeted that lawyer at the big bankers and the finance houses, and they brought in, JP Morgan, they brought in the most prominent bankers in the country, forced them to testify, identified their wrongdoing, sometimes brought criminal actions, sometimes brought civil actions and fines. And that theater, if you will, and there's an element of theater to it, that made it possible to do the banking reforms of the 1930s that ultimately protected us for decades until Bill Clinton undid a lot of them. And so we need to understand that it is possible to achieve accountability, but it has to be sought. It can't be assumed. And I think that's one of the mistakes that we make. We think that, again, as I said before, an economic meltdown or a pandemic is some sort of natural disaster. It's just going to turn out the way it does. Nothing can be done different. That is so fundamentally wrong. Once we understand that crises are made worse by bad players and bad actors in our political and our economic life, and if we then go after them and seek accountability, that's the point at which that we look beyond just punishing them to the reality that we have to have systemic changes that assure that it will never happen again. And I think it's desperately needed. I would love to see the United States Senate open up inquiries tomorrow. There's a House committee that's doing some of this, and I give them credit for that. But most people don't even know it exists, and most people don't even know what we could be doing as regards accountability. Most people don't know that Bernie Sanders proposed a bill to take roughly 60% of the excess profits and gains of the billionaires in a one-time tax. We have avenues by which we could begin to act, but we have to identify them and we have to start moving.
We need to move into questions, but I want to end with the quote by Gore Vidal. Gore Vidal wrote, "Of all the giant slayers now afoot in the great American desert, John Nichols' sword is the sharpest." You got to read this book. And the conclusion at the very end, by the time you finish reading the last chapter, you're reading it out loud because you want someone to give the speech, because you want someone to sort of express the outrage, connect the dots, make people understand that we must demand accountability. And I'm just going to end by saying, when I ran for Congress, someone asked me about why I did politics, John. And you know what my answer was? I said, I do politics because politics is the place where I practice hope.
Mm.
Politics is the place where I practice hope. Remember that, folks, because that's going to be your job. It doesn't just happen. We have to work at it. All right, Elizabeth.
I have
Hey,
questions
Elizabeth.
coming at you from the audience. We've got some good questions too. So let's jump in. We'll start with
Before you ask, Elizabeth, before you ask that first question, thank you, Arnie, for such a good conversation there. It was fabulous.
You're an old friend. How could I not do this?
Elizabeth.
All right, Elizabeth.
A reminder that Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers is available from Gibson's Bookstore. We are happy to do in-store browsing, curbside pickup. We're happy to ship you a book. We will get a book into your hands. Let's start with a first question here from Tom, who this is perhaps going to be the quickest question. Which Republicans specifically said masks were a good idea to Trump, who were trying to convince him?
Oh yeah, there were Republican governors who were saying, look, this is a good idea. Mike DeWine in Ohio was and has continued to suffer politically because he got out in front of this pretty early on. Larry Hogan in Maryland and a number of other Republican governors up in New England and Vermont and Massachusetts. So they were getting input. And also there were people within the White House aides who were saying, look, this is, again, politically smart. Trump's pollster was saying this is politically smart to do this, and yet they were talked out of it. So yeah, I can identify plenty of Republicans who, at least at one moment, thought this was a good idea.
All right. We have several questions here from Mikal. We'll start with this first one here. I've just started the book, but I watched your interview on the Majority Report. You called for an attitude change about holding people accountable. What is behind the reluctance to charge anyone for violations of public health laws? What are some specific laws or statutes that were broken by people like Mark Meadows and Trump's campaign staff that they can be prosecuted on? And why are there no prosecutions? For example, and his staff did not report positive test results to the State Department of Health at the Tulsa rally and then in DC that led to thousands of infections and death in Oklahoma and DC, yet no one was charged.
Yep. I mean, that goes to the heart of what the book is about. And look, here's the thing to understand, because you're asking the why. In fact, the questioner is already pointing out the realities of the gaps that occurred. And the why, I think, is that we have a political class in this country, in both parties, that likes to take power and then say, okay, what happened before is history. Now we're moving forward. And that exists much more in the Democratic Party than it does in the Republican Party. The Republicans are, frankly, you can credit them or dislike them for it, whatever you think, but they're relatively good at pointing a finger of blame at those who came before them. Democrats, when they come to power, have a real tendency to say, let's move forward. Let's be positive, right? Well, there's nothing positive about letting people off the hook when they've done wrong. In fact, it actually sets you up for a real blowback ultimately. And the mistake that I think a lot of people make is to think that if we just don't blame anyone, if we just kind of all get together, that somehow we're gonna solve these problems together. But that hasn't happened. We haven't even come near that. The fact is that a failure of accountability, to my view, has made it more likely that we have political divisions in this country. And instead of uniting us, where we would recognize, yeah, there are some bad players and we ought to have different policies, we end up more and more divided because as the pandemic continues, people just shift the blame from Donald Trump to Joe Biden without recognizing that their motivations are very, very different. The last thing I'll say on that is, yeah, as regards public health laws and violating the laws, one of the fascinating things that I learned in writing the book, and in fact, doing a lot of research on the 1918 flu pandemic, which was, overwhelming. It was called the Spanish flu, and it caused a huge number of deaths. It was a very, very serious circumstance. Well, they arrested people all over the place for not wearing masks. It was an incredibly common thing. In fact, there are stories of cops who arrested and fined mayors in major American cities for showing up at events for not wearing masks. I mean, it was considered such a civic duty. And we've lost some of that in this country. we don't see an ability to hold our elites to account. And I guess that's the final thing I'd say. We have impunity in this country. We have powerful political players and powerful economic players who come into positions of authority and think that they'll never be held to account. And so they act as they choose. And in fact, that sense of impunity is well grounded in our reality. We've got too much history of it.
Let me just add one more thing there, John, because in the book, one of the things you hear all the time is these public health mandates were translated into tyranny. Okay. That's what I mean. And you have judicial, you have Supreme Court justices that say that, you have governors that say that. So that was the line. The line wasn't public health. The line became tyranny. So that's what the translation was. And I think that's what's so frightening, is that when you use those two words together, tyranny and public health, there is a problem for us to find some kind of consensus.
Well, I'll give you one quick example, and Arnie and I always are popcorning off each other here. But one of the chapters I have is on a Supreme Court justice in Wisconsin, Rebecca Bradley, who compared mask mandates and public health orders to the Japanese internment during World War II.
Unbelievable.
And she said, it's the same kind of thing, and then she got called out on it. She said, well, I wasn't really making that comparison. I was just using it as a precedent. But then when she wrote a decision striking down public health protections, she went back to the cases involving the internment of the Japanese, the Korematsu case. And the incredible thing about it is that the guy who played Mr. Sulu on Star Trek, George Takei, had family history as regards the internment. And I closed the chapter on Rebecca Bradley with Takei saying, look, I remember these moments. I remember the internment, and it was different. People were taken out of their homes. They lost their businesses. They were relocated to distant places, in internment camps. And he said, that's not happening to me. I'm sitting at home watching Netflix, right? I mean, that's the difference here. And we need to call these people out for the lie that says it is tyrannical to ask people to wear a mask or to care about their family members, their friends, and their neighbors. It's not tyranny, it's common decency.
So our next question is about mask mandates. Matthew says, when businesses in New Hampshire posts a sign asking people to wear masks, most people comply voluntarily. Why is there so little ground between mandates and non-mandates?
Well, I mean, we've made a ground between it, right? We've suggested that mandates are somehow tyrannical, and that we can get around it. The market will somehow sort this out. Well, the fact is that mandates should be understood as just basically an information, a direction for society that this is something that needs to happen, right? And one of the mistakes I think that occurred was that in that chaotic early moment of the pandemic, when the Trump administration was ricocheting back from saying this is really serious, this is as bad as World War II, we're going to have to unite in the same way, not as bad, and I think even in defense of Trump, not making a direct comparison, but still saying you needed that sort of mobilization. And then the next day saying, well, it's going to go away. It'll probably be gone by Easter, right? And so you had such mixed messages and such chaos. What happens with public health mandates and what happens with public health orders is that we clarify the seriousness of the moment. And if we communicate about them in the right way, what we tell people is, if we do this together, if we all do this together, and we've got to be united in it, we can get through this quicker. We can get back into business. We can get Gibson's opened. We can get the schools back in operation. And in doing the book, I talked to leaders in other countries. I interviewed a number of folks around the world, including Katrín Jakobsdóttir, who is the Prime Minister of Iceland, which, by the way, did fantastic. They did very, very well in the pandemic. They got through the initial stages, got reopened very quickly, got kids back in schools very quickly. And I said, we talked about, what's the trick here? How did Iceland do so well? And she acknowledges it's a small country. There's, different. But one of the things she said was that she didn't go out front very much. She put the doctors and the public health folks forward. They said, here's what's needed. If we do this together, we can get through this and we can get on to the next stage. And that didn't happen in America. Too often we had politicians out front positioning, making speeches, attacking the public health officers. And the end result was that we got incredibly mixed messages. And so circling around to that core question, the mandates and the public health orders were ways to have clarity, right? And had we embraced them in a much more sincere and firm way, I think there's simply no question that we could have gotten through the pandemic with far fewer deaths, far less infection, and frankly, come through much more quickly and much more effectively for society.
I think we have time for about 2 more questions. Barbara asks, can you address even further back in government policy errors? I'm thinking of a 2018 Atlantic article titled, "We Are Not Ready for the Next Pandemic."
Yes.
No.
And talked about the huge slashing of the CDC budget from 2003 to 2018. The budget was halved. Cuts in local health departments, et cetera, all IV bags made in Puerto Rico, et cetera.
Yeah. Look, what this question is getting to is what I, sought to get to in the chapter on Rahm Emanuel and others. There were, decades of bad policy, right? And here's the core answer to that question. And that is that the United States doesn't embrace planning. Other countries around the world do. And in the United States, our attitude too frequently is that planning is bad for us. It might interrupt the market. It might end up telling companies what they have to do. And there's this sort of neoliberal theory that if you just step back and you don't plan, you just sort of let commerce figure this thing out, that it'll all sort out in the end. But what that loses sight of is that there are political motivations, people who get involved and get engaged for their own political advancement, but there's also capitalism. And, capitalism can be a very, very effective system in a lot of ways, I think, especially for small bookstores and independent bookstores across the country. But when it's allowed to run rampant and without controls, without regulations, you end up in a situation where there's going to be a race to the bottom. There's going to be a race to the cheapest, easiest ways to do things. And it doesn't necessarily respond as is necessary. Now, when they were cutting the CDC, you had people who said, "Oh, the private sector can do this better, right? Let's just let it go there." Well, no, the private sector couldn't do it better, and the pharmaceutical companies, left to their own devices, aren't going to be doing the cutting edge research. They're going to be, figuring out baldness cures, right? They will. I promise you, they're going to go for the cheapest cosmetic interventions that they think they can make the most quick bucks off of. And so we need government to come in to regulate, to guide, to plan. And planning is one of the reasons why countries like Germany, countries in many of the Scandinavian countries, came through the pandemic so much more effectively than the United States did. Because when the pandemic hit, they had a public health system. They had a single payer Medicare for all type system. They also had a social welfare state. And so when you had massive layoffs, instead of everybody losing their jobs, they had a situation where the government would come in and make sure that people could stay on their jobs and do sort of a balancing of things. And we could do that. It's not hard. And I tell you, we'd end up, we were told we'll end up like a hellhole, like some sort of horrible thing will happen if we start planning. And I think of, what kind of hellhole, like Denmark or Norway? Please, it's not bad to do planning. And yet, as the questioner well points out, we failed to plan at critical stages.
Let me just say something. I wrote something down as you were talking. I wrote, healthcare is a profit opportunity in America. It is not a right. The definition of why do we cut the CDC? Because the term public health means it isn't a profit opportunity. Because of the word, there is no profit in public health. There is in healthcare, and they've obviously mined it for that. And when you actually look at some of the most successful places for dealing with the coronavirus, guess where it was? The VA.
Yeah.
I interviewed a reporter about the VA. The VA was remarkable in what they were able to do for the people that they were serving,
Heroic.
much better than the rest of the country. So as everyone sort of rolls their eyes whenever you say the VA, take a look at how effective the VA was in protecting the people that they serve. They were highly effective.
That's exactly right.
It's important.
And I'll give you one other example too. You know, you look at countries like Costa Rica with far lower healthcare costs, but have huge commitments to public health.
Exactly.
When they build a new apartment building, they put a health clinic in one of the apartments, right? So that there's always this incredible level of access to public health. And you know, when you make that baseline commitment, then when a crisis hits, you can respond to it. And so again, you can tell the passion that I think both Arnie and I bring to a question like that one, and I hope it infuses the book throughout. But yeah, I think you have at least one more question, Elizabeth.
Yeah. So someone did ask, what can you talk about the need for consequences for spreading medical misinformation? What can be done to actively stop lies from politicians, people like Joe Rogan? Or someone else asked a similar question. I think you've already addressed. They mentioned Tucker Carlson. You've already mentioned that we do need to be calling these people out. But I think this question here is really good. Mikhail says, can you talk about the level of threats and intimidation that public health officials have been facing?
Oh, yes.
And the failure of law enforcement to charge people for the threats that they've been facing? What has been the impact on public health officials? Which, I mean, we're losing an entire generation of doctors and nurses right now.
We are losing doctors and nurses, and many of them are being lost, not just because of intimidation, but also just because they're overwhelmed. It's just been too hard. We've asked too much of them and not given them the level of support that we should. But that question goes right to the heart of the matter. I know, and in fact, for the book, interviewed public health folks, and it's amazing. There are people who show up on their lawns. They're literally threatened. There are public health officials around the country whose lives have been threatened for doing mask mandates. I attended several rallies of people protesting against public health orders, because that's part of my job too. And I went wearing my mask amongst a lot of people who weren't wearing masks. There were people who showed up with automatic weapons at those rallies. And the threat factor, the intimidation factor is surreal. And yes, I think that you get to the heart of the matter, that there are laws that say that you cannot threaten someone, right? I don't think we have to protect a public health official any more than we have to protect your next door neighbor, right? I mean, it's that I'm not asking for, you know, some sort of exponential extra intervention here, but what I am saying is that it's clear that we let a lot of people off the hook. We let people make deadly threats, and we do it all the time. Now we have election officials all across the country who are quitting because their lives have been threatened because they said that, you know, the 2020 election was legitimately decided. And so we've got a real problem in this country as regards accountability for those who make deadly threats against public officials who are simply trying to do good. And one final thing I would emphasize too, this is not something that happens merely on the fringes, you know, out on the edge of the internet. We have politicians, and I write chapters on them in the book, people like Ron Johnson from Wisconsin and Rand Paul from Kentucky, who literally have used their platforms to aggressively seek to discredit public health officials and public health information in this country. And then they turn around and fundraise off it. You know, Rand Paul was literally attacking Dr. Fauci. And I don't think Dr. Fauci's been right on everything. I actually think he's made missteps, but I think he's a sincere man of science who was trying, in my view, to get things right. And when he made mistakes, he tended to admit to them. And I give him credit for that. Again, not giving him a pass on mistakes along the way. But Rand Paul was attacking Dr. Fauci. And then turns out he was putting up Fire Fauci fundraising appeals on his website, you know, coming off each of the attacks. He would have this whole high profile attack, and then he would make a major effort to raise money off it. At the end of the day, when we talk about accountability, it isn't just charging people with a crime if they've actually threatened someone's life. It is also holding politicians to account and asking, you know, why is it that you use this platform, this bully pulpit, in a way that is so detrimental and so destructive to the efforts of hardworking, sincere people who just want to save lives.
And I want to remind everyone that I said way back when that accountability requires courage. That's courage of us. Okay. That's not the courage. The politician will only be as courageous as we are courageous. So I want to connect the dots too, that we have to show that kind of courage. And that really is how we get to demand the accountability. Accountability, as you said, John, over and over again, doesn't just happen. It doesn't just happen. It needs to be demanded. And to demand it means sometimes you have to be in front of that doctor to protect that doctor. You know, you have to use yourself as part of that courageous act in order to actually accomplish the accountability you so desire. And I think that's where there's a burden on us, but we should be prepared to accept that burden.
Well, it is in fact the burden or the challenge of being a part of society.
Exactly.
Right. And at this point, we're living in a very chaotic moment. There's simply no question of that. The pandemic has made it more chaotic. There's no doubt that a lot of Americans have suffered. It isn't just folks who've gotten sick, have lost a loved one. It's also students who've had real challenges, real setbacks as regards education. Folks who've suffered immense anxiety and mental health challenges. This has been a traumatic time. And accountability throughout history has been a tool that allows us to get through trauma, that allows us to understand that what has happened to us isn't just some sort of natural disaster. It isn't some sort of occurrence that we don't have control over. That when we have accountability, we can say, okay, something bad has happened. We've all been through a lot of hell here, but there are people who made it worse. And if we can hold them to account, we begin to get clarity about what happened, and we begin to give people a sense that they may be protected in the future, that this isn't going to be a recurring nightmare. And so that's why I wrote the book. I want the nightmare to end. I want us to wake up to a reality that we don't have to accept impunity. What we should be seeking is a just and fair and decent world. And we should demand that we can live in that world. The way to get there is to demand accountability for the coronavirus criminals and the pandemic profiteers, and to say that that accountability will forge the changes that assure that we will never be left so vulnerable as we have been over the last 2 years.
Well said. Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers by John Nichols is available at Gibson's Bookstore. Thank you, John, for joining us this evening. Thank you, Arnie, as well. That's all the time we have for this evening. Have a great night, everybody.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.